Today we're going to be going back over evolution and Darwin's theory of natural selection, part 1. We're going to go back and hit the high points. We've already discussed this in class last week, but I want to talk about some main things that are discussed in here. Actually, let's turn to page 10. That's where I want to start. And we're also going to discuss a little bit of classification, some basics that you need to know here to get started when discussing evolution. Now, that means it's time to start. When I was at a study session one time, I used to do all these study sessions for the AP exam, and I would go and teach. There'd be a bunch of different classes, people from all over come in, and we were talking about evolution. And so I started out one time, I was like, what is evolution? And somebody from Walker County, what is evolution? Your kid raised his hand. He's like, not dying and having sex. And I was like, that's pretty much it, right? You're trying to survive, and you're trying to live, and you're trying to pass on your traits. So those are two very important things in the evolutionary process: surviving and passing on your traits, not dying and having sex. Now, the more elaborate version of what is evolution is this. It's the change in a population's allele frequency, okay? So alleles, remember, are different forms of a gene. So we are going to put some mathematical data to this to actually see when populations evolve and how they're evolving. So we'll do this later on this week and next week. And I think in 9th grade, you guys probably touched on Hardy-Weinberg a little bit. Yes, no? P squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. Remember that? So we're going to discuss using some quantitative data, how populations can change over time. And that'll be especially important in our big lab next week. Oh yeah, and speak of big lab, you guys for Monday of next week need to have a partner, and y'all need to bring in at least, not at least, you need to bring in one normal size box of Teddy Grahams. Now, the flavor of Teddy Grahams doesn't really matter as long as some of the bears have their arms up and some of the bears have their arms down, okay? So at some point before Monday, find a partner in class, and one of you bring in some Teddy Grahams, split the cost, and then once we're done, y'all can have at it with the Teddy Grahams. So, where were we? I didn't finish the definition of evolution. So a change in a population's allele frequency over time in response to the environment. So the driving factor behind most of evolution is environmental changes. So as the environment changes, it influences individuals that are able to survive and pass on their traits. Okay? So we talked a little bit about Darwin, about natural selection, how he came to this. We're going to get more in depth with that today. We're also going to talk more about survival of the fittest. We're also going to talk about how Darwin didn't really use the term evolution all that much. I think it was one time in his book that he wrote on Origin of the Species. He used a different phrase. So I know we kind of think of Darwin as the father of evolution, kind of like we think of Mendel as the father of genetics, but he didn't really use that term, although the term essentially means what we talk of when we talk about evolution. All right, and another guy that we discussed the other day is Linnaeus. Linnaeus came up with our current taxonomy system. So remember, in taxonomy, it's a way of grouping organisms based on similar characteristics. You need to think about this like a family tree. So on the AP exam, almost every evolution FRQ has to do with a cladogram. Now, a cladogram basically looks like a branched off like family tree, okay? And so most of the time what happens is they give you some data about genetic similarities in organisms, and you have to fill out that cladogram or family tree. Sometimes it's referred to as a phylogenetic tree. Basically, it means how closely related those organisms are. And so the more similarities they have in common, closer they are together. The less they have in common, the farther they are apart. That's the simple version, Walker. So, speaking of family trees, let's kind of divide up organisms into the three main biggest groups, which we call domains. What are the three main domains? Yeah, so you have eubacteria. Sometimes they just say bacteria, but the eubacteria, true bacteria. You have archaeobacteria, okay? And then you have eukarya, which we would just call eukaryotes, okay? So those three groups. Remember, bacteria, they're not all created equal. They're basically a big difference between the eubacteria and archaeobacteria is this layer of peptidoglycan, which is like a sugar protein component that's around their cell wall. And so that's different between those two. And then eukaryotes, obviously, they're very different because of the nucleus and organelles. So to get a little more inclusive from that, we go to kingdoms. Now, in the kingdoms, how many kingdoms do we have? I think we discussed 5 the other day, right? In another group that didn't really fit nicely into a kingdom. So when we talk about kingdoms, we're going to discuss animal kingdom, plant kingdom, fungi kingdom, the archaeobacteria, eubacteria. Now, and we said this is a little bit different from your 9th grade book. A lot of 9th grade books put protists in a kingdom to themselves. So, like you'll see the protist kingdom. I think the old biology book still may have that. Your big boy and girl biology book that's used in college does not group protists into a kingdom. It calls them a group of clades, C-L-A-D-E-S. Clade just means a similar grouping. Okay? So, and remember, the 3 main types of protists are animal-like protists, plant-like protists, fungus-like protists. So they're basically microscopic organisms living in moist environments that don't fit neatly in those other groups. Okay? But they're not necessarily closely related to one another. All right. So as we get less inclusive, meaning a more narrow group of organisms, you go from kingdom to phylum. A good example of a phylum, like the animal kingdom is an example of a kingdom. A phylum is like chordata is the one listed in your book there, which means all of the things with backbones, basically. And then you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, remember, when you see a scientific name, it's always in italics. The first word is the genus, and it's always capitalized, and the second word is the individual species, and it's always in lowercase. Okay? So it's going from domain is most inclusive, includes the most things, to least inclusive, the species, which is just one particular type of organism. Okay? So we talked a little bit about Hutton and Lyell. They're pretty significant geologists because Darwin read Lyell's book, and basically it talked about how the Earth changes over time and how the Earth's still changing today, like plates move apart, plates come together, volcanoes erupt. And so there's massive erosion like the Grand Canyon. So the same geologic forces going on today have been going on for a long period of time. And when the geology changes, that also changes the environment that organisms live in. And when the environment changes, then organisms have to adapt, they evolve, or they die out. And so we'll see a lot of that. Lamarck, we talked about how, poor guy, he kind of got it wrong. Just because you chop off your arm doesn't mean your kid's going to be missing an arm. So he talked about inheritance of acquired characteristics. Although in recent times we have discovered there is inheritance of acquired characteristics. You could sort of apply to this when we talk about epigenetics, where things that you do in your lifetime could be methylated, and basically switches could be turned on or off in your genetics, and then that could be passed on to your offspring. So that's a field that's pretty recent. And then the last guy, Malthus, is also important to Darwin. Because he talked about basically like there's a limited number of resources, kind of like think supply and demand. And based on those limited resources, you're going to have a lot of organisms, limited resources, not every one of them is going to survive. And so that all played into Darwin's thinking and how he came up with what we know in terms of how organisms, a lot about how organisms evolve and change. Okay? So we're going to skip on to part 2. And let's slide back over to 464 in the book. There's not much in here today that you need, but there's a couple things we'll probably look at. All right. So, important concepts from previous units. Read those first 2 for us, Matthew.
Reproduction is necessary to make the next generation. Genes are segments of DNA and nucleotides that code for traits by polypeptide expression.
So, you don't have evolution without reproduction. Why? There's no passing on of traits. So, reproduction is essential. Survival is essential, at least to the reproduction part, right? So, you've got to survive till you reproduce, or there is no change. Genes, those are things that are going to be inherited and passed on. So, those are going to express the traits that we see in organisms. 3 and 4, Walker.
Mendelian genetics deals with the inheritance patterns of genes and gametes. Populations are defined as the same species in the same place at the same time and showing reproduction.
Okay, so inheritance patterns are important because they show us like things that we inherit from our parents and that are passed into our offspring. And so some of these things are considered good or strong traits, and some of them are considered weak traits. Now, that's kind of a relative term in a lot of cases because sometimes a strong trait can become a weak trait, and sometimes a weak trait may become a strong trait depending on environmental changes. Okay, so those are things we'll look at and talk about. Populations. So we said earlier that evolution is the change in a population's, allele frequency. Populations evolve and not individuals. You can have an individual that has mutations that may be beneficial for survival, but if they don't survive and reproduce and pass those traits on, then that's not going to change anything, right? Except that one individual, and it'll die out with them. So it has to be passed on through that population, those traits. One we'll look at a lot is sickle cell. Sickle cell is one of those inherited traits that happened at some point that was beneficial in some ways. It was also harmful in some ways. So, but it turns out it looks like the benefits outweighed the harmful. And in doing so, it helped a lot of people survive. So we'll look at how that played into. I think that's actually a big part of our lab we'll do next week. All right. In 1809, Charles Darwin is born. Funny enough, Abraham Lincoln was born on the same day. Is that coincidence? I don't know, Katie. Read A and B for us.
Me?
Yeah, you.
Darwin attends University of Edinburgh.
Edinburgh, yeah. Edinburgh.
Edinburgh at age of 16 to become a doctor like his father and grandfather did. Darwin, wishing to not pursue medicine, leaves Edinburgh to attend Christ's College of Cambridge to pursue being a naturalist, someone who studies nature.
I imagine his parents were disappointed. Anyway, back in the day, if you wanted to be like a scientist, not that there's anything wrong with that, usually you either went the doctor route or you went the naturalist route. Naturalist basically just meant like you were a biologist, basically. And so, who knows? He's probably like me and didn't like cutting people open and being responsible for life or death. And judging from the how medicine was back in the mid-1800s, I don't blame him, to be honest with you. So he decided he wasn't going to be like Pop and his grandpa and be a doctor. He wanted to be a naturalist. So he was also studying to be a priest because it was a religious university. Most naturalists at the time were also priests. You could probably think of like Mendel, Mendel the monk. He was doing lots of studying. I don't know if he had any formal training, but a lot of people were also religious at those times. So anyway, in December of 1831, you graduated. What happens next, Miranda? Go.
Part B.
Part A.
Darwin has graduated college, and instead of entering the seminary, he decides to join Captain Robert Fitzroy on the HMS Beagle as a
Quick, what does HMS stand for? All you English people out there know this. Y'all don't watch James Bond? Get your lives together. HMS. Her Majesty's ship. Keep going. Her Majesty.
and naturalist of the ship. All ships at this time were required to have a naturalist on board in case a new species were found.
Interesting. So basically, he became a naturalist, and they stuck him on a ship. So remember, this is like colonial Britain here. They're going around trying to conquer the world, and they want somebody who can also identify different species that may be of benefit or help them out. And so they've got people on these ships that are going around collecting samples. And if you go to the British Museum of Natural History, those jokers have samples from the last 200 or 300 years. There's supposed to be like thousands of things hanging out in the back, things that have been collected from all over the world. Anyway, so they put him on a ship. He collects a bunch of samples, fossils, whatever. He's making observations at the same time, right? They're going around there doing their ship things. I don't know what they're moving, but anyway. On the journey, what does it take? 5 years. He collects plants, animals, fossils at every stop. And on the trip, he has 2 important readings that he takes along with him. The Principles of Geology by Lyell and the Principles of Populations by Malthus. And so these influenced his thinking. So he was thinking about like Malthus, like there's a limited number of resources, there's a big population, only certain individuals are going to be able to survive. And then the Lyell thing with geology, okay, the environment is constantly changing over time. How does that influence those resources and those populations and how they grow and develop over time? Okay? So in 1859, this is what? 23 years after he came back from his voyage, he writes on origin of species by means of natural selection. Okay. Now, like I said, he didn't use the word evolution very much. He used what phrase?
Natural selection.
Nope. Descent with modification. Now, if you think about it, descent means things that are passed along, and modification means changes. So these are descendants with modifications from previous individuals. You can think of like chickens coming from, or birds coming from dinosaurs. So they're descendants with slight modifications or big modifications in some cases. Okay? It says it only used the word evolution one time in the book. So he was really focused on this descending and modifying that's taking place here. But essentially, he's talking about evolution. How do things evolve and change over time? Okay? Natural selection. Let's go through here and talk about what that actually means. Now, we said natural selection is another way of saying survival of the fittest. So nature is selecting the individuals with the best traits to pass on those traits. You know, they're the ones that get to survive and pass on those traits to their offspring. Okay? Now, when I say nature selects, it just means like if you're living in an environment, like if you're a squirrel or a hawk or whatever, the better your traits are for survival, the more likely you are to survive and the more likely you are to pass on your offspring, right? Now, sometimes you may be the most fit individual in the world, Walker, and lightning may strike you and you may die, which could be a tragedy. But, you know, when you're talking about populations as a whole, then you would expect overall things are going to be, they're going to be improving in terms of their environment over time. Okay? So, natural selection, part A. Read that one for us, Ashlyn.
This theory of Darwin's basically states that in nature there are different levels of success in reproduction based on the ability to survive in an environment. The differing rates of success act as a filtering rod effect on many traits.
Ooh. So when we say weak versus strong, strong means beneficial, weak means not beneficial. Normally we think of strength, and strength is, like physical strength, is important in terms of survival in a lot of cases. But it may not be the most important thing. It may be like mental strength. Being able to handle tough situations may be more important. So there are a lot of things that could be considered a strong trait, and those traits may vary. Like, let's say that you're all a room, let's say we're a room full of caribou. Previous to the last ice age. Okay, now the earth starts getting colder. We're all caribou. Who do you think is going to survive?
Whoever's the thickest coat.
Whoever's got the thickest coat, whoever is able to put on the most fat underneath their skin, those are probably going to be the individuals that survive into that cold ice age, right? The individuals with thin coats, prancing around with their lean muscles, and then it gets cold and they're like shivering and they freeze to death. Am I right, Mason? Yeah. So what was considered maybe a strong trait then becomes a weak trait. Now, let's say the earth starts to heat back up. It's warming back up. You got that thick coat. You got a lot of subcutaneous fat, and things are getting hot. Yeah, Nelly, it's getting hot. And a lot of things can't shed that thick coat. And so maybe some of the individuals that have some of those traits still for thinner coats and are more lean and able to get around better and don't need to eat as much, maybe they are better adapted for survival post-Ice Age, right? So a lot of it is relative to what your environment is. Now, when you're thinking about, let's talk about people a little bit here. And since I'm putting this on the internet, I'm going to be very careful. Do people follow natural selection very well nowadays? Why not, Mason?
I mean, it's not like the typical things that the environment would kill off.
Okay, so the environment typically doesn't kill off most people with weak traits nowadays. Why?
Because we like industrialized medicines and
Yeah, we're industrialized. We have food for most people. Most people are able to get health care even if they have certain physical or mental weaknesses in a lot of cases. And so survival isn't that difficult in modern times like it would have been 100, 200, 500, 5,000 years ago, right? 5,000 years ago, everybody's running around. You're in a tribe somewhere, Ashland. If you're not out fighting a buffalo or collecting enough berries, you're probably starving to death, right? So survival of the fittest is very differently. I mean, the most survival we have to do is go down to Walmart and make sure we come out with enough, TVs on Black Friday. Am I right? Never mind. So anyway, you get the idea. Now, let's think about, maybe just analyze yourself. When you're under stress, what was that? Somebody mentioned this morning, there's some type of stress curve. Have you ever heard of this? Where every individual has like an optimal work that they're able to do, the optimal work. Like some people, if they don't have a certain amount of stress or like pressure they're put under, they can't perform well. But some people, if they, have too much stress, they can't perform well either. So everybody kind of fits on, I can't remember what the name of the curve is. You know what I'm talking about? You ever heard of this? Okay. So anyway, so everybody kind of falls on this curve about where they're most productive. Like some people need it to be like the last hour of the day where they can turn something in just to get after it. And under that pressure, they're able to perform and put out their like best work. And for like me, I need to have it done like 3 days ahead of time and review it about 5 times before I can put something out there. So it varies kind of from person to person. But environmental stresses can have a big effect on your ability to function. Skipping on down, let's talk about population. So we talked about populations evolve and not individuals. So that means if a population is going to evolve, you can't just have mutations or changes in an individual in their body cells. The only changes that can actually affect the greater population is changes in what? Sex cells. So it has to be changes in either the sperm or egg cells, and those traits have to be passed on, right? So we were talking this morning, and somebody reminded me of this. We were talking about like people, like we were a while ago. Some individuals we maybe consider more fit or less fit based on certain characteristics. And when I say fitness, I'm not talking about like your athletic fitness. Fitness means ability to survive, right? So back in the 60s or 70s, I watched this documentary on these guys, and there was like this famous sperm bank out in California. And basically, I can't remember the name of it or the whole backstory, but basically they were getting like these guys that they considered to be the most fit individuals they could find. These were like intellectuals, they were like Olympic athletes, and these would be people that we would consider to like have the best of the best traits, right? And so they were getting them to donate sperm to sperm banks, and then women would come in and they would there's a catalog, and you could pick who you wanted to pick, like characteristics, like Mr. So-and-so was an Olympic athlete, and he was tall and had blonde hair and blah, 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 right? All his teeth were straight. And so you could pick out so-and-so had an IQ of 160, and, you know, your kid would be super smart probably, or hopefully help him out. So you could go in and pick out those characteristics that you wanted in an offspring. So that's really kind of going to that natural, well, that's more of what we would call artificial selection, right? Humans picking traits to get certain offspring. But that's not a lot different than you see in nature with like deer, right? Deer or hippos or a lot of animals, females will pick a certain male that they want to mate with that has certain characteristics, right? And so he has to be the most fit, the strongest. And he's the one that gets to pass on their traits. Whereas humans are a little bit different. Who passes on their traits in humanity? Like people. Do we only have certain people that pass on traits? Most everybody passes on their traits. I mean, most people are in monogamous relationships, right? So you have one man, one woman, and that's pretty much everybody in the world's getting to pair up and pass on their traits. Some have more kids than others, but everybody's pretty much passing on their traits. So you usually don't see a huge shift in offspring and what those offspring look like. Okay? So I don't know. We'll see if do we see changes in the population though? Like in the U.S., have we seen changes in the U.S. population over the last 50 years? You think the population's changed any?
I think like they've grown like.
I mean, besides growth, like just different individuals. What group do you think's grown the most in the last 50 years?
Like population.
Yeah, just like racially or ethnicity wise. What?
Latin Americans.
Oh yeah. People coming from Latin America. So definitely that population has grown quite a bit. So, and that's primarily due to what though? Immigration. Some of it could be due to increased birth rate, but primarily immigration. So you see this in a lot of different countries when individuals move in, maybe there's more migration and then those individuals have lots of babies. It can change the dynamic of a population. That's pretty something superficial, but it's easy to see those differences. And if you think about like North America 500 years ago, most everybody was? Native Americans, right? So indigenous people that lived here. And so if you think about the population now, it's changed pretty dramatically, right? So in terms of just where people come from and what they look like, it's changed dramatically. The indigenous populations are very small now, you know? So populations do change. Sometimes it's individuals moving in and out. Sometimes it's just a higher level of reproduction. And so some individuals just do better in some locations than others. And so we're going to apply this to different plants and different animals. But humans are an easy way to look at it because I think we just look at each other so much and we see differences and we see where people come from. And so we can see these movements and changes that occur over time. It's funny, like when I was growing up, they used to call America, what was it? The melting pot. You heard this term? And then for a while, they switched it to the salad bowl. Have y'all heard that one? Because, like, basically, they called it a melting pot for a while, saying, like, you have all these, like, different cultures and ethnicities and races coming together. And so it's kind of like melding into one thing. But then I guess somebody realized, like, you still have, like, Chinatown, or you have different places where different cultures still kind of congregate, and they're distinct in certain ways. And that's how it went to the salad bowl, where you have like your tomatoes over here and your lettuce over here. I don't know. And then, I don't know, maybe we're back to the melting pot. I think nowadays it's probably back in that direction. What do y'all think? Y'all don't care, do you?